Who are the Gen Z and why are they protesting in Nepal? Are these protests similar to what happened in Pakistan in 2021 and 2023? Is it similar to what happened in Sri Lanka in 2022?
There was lack of economic opportunity. There was also elite corruption, elite collusion. The politicians were all scratching each other's backs. Young people even in the West or here can't afford houses, can't afford jobs. The reason being that there are just too few jobs thanks to automation, globalization, etc.
Nepal's youth, the Gen Z, are railing openly against what they call Nepo Babies that we saw in the protests. Whereas in India, our youth are celebrating a very rich, extravagant wedding that Mr. Ambani had for his children, saying that it is his money, he's spending it, why should we be concerned about it?
It's also partly the religious nature of the population where people accept it as our fate and push it to another life. It's also to a large extent the fact that this dream is being sold of capitalism, that you too can become rich. You too can one day, if you work hard enough, join this elite company.
So I think Sonia Gandhi got it wrong when she called Modi in 2014 a maut ka saudagar. In fact, like you're saying, he's an ummeed ka saudagar.
We are seeing something similar in India.
What can India do to, let's say, prevent something of this sort to happen? Who are the Gen Z and why are they protesting in Nepal? Are these protests similar to what happened in Pakistan in 2021 and 2023? Is it similar to what happened in Sri Lanka in 2022? Is it similar to what happened in Myanmar? And most importantly, is it similar to what happened in the July revolution in Bangladesh in 2024? We will try to use the Nepal upheaval as a springboard to try and understand these broader political currents across South Asia and to test the idea of exceptionalism in India against this regional turmoil, or in other words, is India next? To help us understand these things, we have Professor Mohsin Raza Khan, who is also the Executive Dean of the Center for New South Asia at the Jindal School of International Affairs. Welcome to The Wire, Mr. Mohsin.
Thanks, Pavan.
Mr. Mohsin, let me begin by asking a very simple question. Who are these Gen Z and why are they protesting in Nepal?
Well, it's got a long history. Primarily, I would say the deeper reason and the longer reason is the unemployment situation there. That is, about 1,000 Nepalis leave Nepal every year for employment. We get various numbers, 4 to 5 lakh leave every year. And this lack of opportunity and what they're watching online, that is the Nepo Babies, that is the children of these politicians, are leading lifestyles of such extravagance without earning anything. And because Nepal is quite a free society, the media is very free, much freer than here, and there's much greater freedom of speech. They are watching and criticizing it. They were getting angry that where are these guys getting their money from? And there's the general feeling that the same set of people have ruled Nepal for the last 25, 30 years. They keep rotating the various political leaders. So there was an anger building up. The immediate trigger was the social media ban. Gen Z spent so much time on social media that really aggravated them. But the spark could have been other things as well, as we saw in Bangladesh. It was reservations in Bangladesh. They were angry that government jobs had been reserved for Awami League supporters. Of course, in Bangladesh, there had also been political repression because it had been ruled by an autocrat who was not allowing free elections, was carrying out extrajudicial killings, etc., tortures. In Sri Lanka, the trigger was something else. It was high price rise. There was a foreign exchange crisis because of the gross mismanagement by the Rajapaksa brothers and Gotabaya. It could be something else, So the immediate trigger was that. But as I said, there were deeper reasons. There were lack of economic opportunity. There was also elite corruption, elite collusion. The politicians were all scratching each other's backs, not investigating each other. People felt like they didn't have a voice, especially the young people. So when this social media ban happened, it was kind of the last straw, and it exploded.
All right, so let's stick with Gen Z for a moment, right? Now, for the viewers, Gen Z is basically all those kids who were born after 1995 and 2012, I think. Now, I was also talking to one of my colleagues, Elisha, who is part of the Gen Z, and I asked her the very same question. Why is the Gen Z being so restive, right, and restless? And her response was very interesting. She said that it feels like all the misfortune and the mismanagement of all that happened over the last few decades has sort of accrued, and the Gen Z is at the receiving end of all of this flood of mismanagement of political parties and politicians across the world. And she feels this great, weight on top of her. Would you agree with that assessment? And also, just to link it to this idea of the fact that there is something called a youth bulge, right, or the demographic dividend in India's case, where a major section of the population is young, between the ages of say 21 and 35. I think in India it is about more than 50%, if I'm not wrong. Now in Nepal also we are seeing this youth bulge and mass unemployment. Again, in India, the unemployment over the last decade has increased by about 10, if not more percentage points, depending on how you measure it. In Nepal also there's this youth bulge, this mass unemployment erupt into what we saw was some intense violence, right? It feels like it is going more and more intense as compared to say what happened in other neighborhoods. Now, is this anger on Kathmandu streets the direct result of a generation of young men and women with no economic future, which is a problem that is simmering across the region?
Yeah, absolutely right. Gen Z is right to feel that they are feeling the pressure for several reasons. First of all, life has become increasingly unaffordable. Young people, even in the West or here, can't afford houses, can't afford jobs. The reason being that there are just too few jobs, thanks to automation, globalization, etc., shipping of jobs. In the developing world especially, we are seeing more and more using of capital instead of labor in production processes. So there's a lack of jobs. This in the developing world is accompanied with a demographic bulge, which is called the youth bulge. That is, somewhere it's called demographic dividend, which basically means that the working age population between the ages of 15 and 65 is larger than the dependent population, which is children and old people. Many countries have seen their greatest growth during this period. That is, this period usually lasts for a period of time as population growth rates are declining. You have a bulge because there are less children being born, but there are more young people of working age population. Now, this is all fine. Having a youth bulge can lead to economic growth, which we saw in, say, the case of China, Japan, and other East Asian countries, Taiwan. But if these people don't get jobs, it has also been noticed historically that it can lead to violence. Steven Pinker, etc., and others, Ian Morris, have pointed out that 90-95% of the violence takes place due to young men. That is, testosterone causes violence if it is not gainfully employed. We have seen that it has led to protests even in the US. For example, the 1960s anti-Vietnam War protests were fueled by this baby boomers generation, which was a youth bulge which started in 1945 to 1965 or so in the United States. And we are seeing the same thing in, for example, the Arab Spring. We saw that the Arab countries had a youth bulge from the 1990s onwards. Finally, it exploded around 2010-11 because of the lack of opportunity. And young men, even in their 30s, could not get married, find a job, or start a family. And that frustration. So we are seeing something similar in Asia now, in South Asia. India too is having this youth bulge. India's demographic dividend supposedly started in 2005 and will end by 2055. But this would be an explosive situation if we can't get them jobs. So far, we are not managing to get them jobs. We are supposed to generate about, just according to population increase, we are supposed to generate about 12 million jobs a year. But we are not anywhere close to that. We are not even generating, most of our jobs are in the gig economy, etc., and very few well-paying jobs. So frustration is building up, frustration built up in Nepal and in Bangladesh before that. That's why the hunger for government jobs, reservations, and it can explode on any issue. One can't predict what issue it will explode on,
Now, the Gen Z has been identified as a cultural category, right? They like particular things, like you said, they like spending a lot of time on social media. It could be an identification of a particular fashion, for instance, or a penchant for liking some popular culture, being, let's say, fans of music, or a certain kind of expression that usually these people have on social media. But that is just a cultural aspect of it. I want you to focus a little bit on the socioeconomic aspect of what constitutes this Gen Z. Going back to what Elisha mentioned, There is a very interesting concept called cruel optimism that was proposed by this scholar called Lauren Berlant, where she talks about how at a particular point in history, it has been declared that this is the way forward in terms of how the economy should be managed, the Washington Consensus and so on. In fact, it's encoded in this very famous phrase by Margaret Thatcher called "Tina, there is no other alternative." So what Laurent is trying to say in her book is that cruel optimism is produced when you believe that certain policies that are essentially going to be beneficial to you are the ones that become obstacles for your development. So for instance, the promises for, a good life fantasy, a cluster of promises that have been made, which created this sort of aspirational generation, which has been told that you have the earth and the sky, and that is the limit. The sky is the limit, right? And it also creates a sort of an affective structure of hope, where hope sort of becomes this sweetmeat that is sold by politicians across the world. We see that in the turn towards populism across the country, across the world, in fact. Now, she also points out that this has created this situation of cruel optimism, where earlier people thought capitalism moved from one crisis to the other, but now she says, crisis is the default, and the relief to this crisis sort of becomes the window where people can breathe. So given all of this, can you tell us how this Gen Z is impacted by this long durée sort of build-up of economic policies, and like Elisha is mentioning, ultimately it accrues and becomes a burden on them, and this is the cruel optimism of it?
Yeah, see, the hopelessness that Gen Z is feeling in many cases, whether it's even in the West, we know that one of the reasons that many people turn to populism towards Trump, etc., and Brexit also, was because they felt that they couldn't afford houses, they couldn't afford to start families, they felt that they were getting a more raw deal than what, say, the boomers got, etc. And they blame immigrants, or they'll blame, the export of jobs, which is partly responsible, but really the major work is being done by technology, by increasing automation, etc. And now with the coming of AI, it's only going to get worse. So how are we going to handle this? And therefore, various solutions have been proposed, from universal basic income, where everybody gets a certain minimum, a move towards more socialistic policies, in some countries, such as what Mamdani is proposing, Zoran in New York. We saw even a person in the United States who in earlier generations may not have been favored at all, like Bernie Sanders, getting a lot of popularity, but thanks to, or unfortunately due to, the internal politics of the Democratic Party, he was not allowed to become a candidate for US presidentship. We are seeing something similar in India. Despite the speedy economic growth of 7.58, 8.59% that the UPA years saw, say between 2004 and 2012, India was not able to generate enough jobs. Still, there was some generation of jobs and incomes did rise. In fact, people who today say that we are growing at 7.5%, most economists don't buy that. The data is not supporting India growing at that rate at all. Whether you look at the freight data, electricity data, you look at the consumption data, which is much lower, you look at the credit uptake data, India is not showing that kind of growth. In fact, in the last quarter's growth, they showed that our imports had declined by 13%, thanks to which our GDP increased. Imports declining tends to boost up your GDP increase because they used a different deflator number for that price deflation. All kinds of things are being done to cook up the data, but jobs are not being generated, and that is the biggest proof. In fact, those maybe of your and my generation, or maybe Gen Z has not seen it, who would remember the growth that when we were actually growing at 7.5, 8.5%, the kind of income growth and employment growth that we saw in India in the 2000s, would know that this is nowhere close. You feel it. You can feel it in your lifestyle. You can feel it in your incomes. Incomes have not increased. So we know that this growth, even if you just take the average of the government data between 2018 and today, if you take out the 2 COVID years also, where it fell fast and then it rose fast, that was a statistical anomaly. Average growth rate is about 4.8% according to the government's own data. The last quarter before COVID struck, our growth rate was somewhere around 3.8% in 2019. So we're not growing that fast. We're not able to, when we are growing, we're not able to generate enough jobs. So it's right, they're right to feel that, look, we have lesser opportunities than our parents. housing prices have gone up to insane levels. You can't get a house in any metro for less than 3 crores. Sometimes they go up to 5-6 crores. So they do feel priced out. How can you with your salaries afford it? So they're right to feel frustrated. There's lack of opportunity, and there's all kinds of other problems, whether it's climate change and they see the social tensions and violence, etc. They're right to feel a bit hopeless, and they're looking for solutions. They're looking for a leader who can lead them out. Each time they look towards a leader with hope, whether it was Obama or Modi, or they look to these people, and that's why the most successful ones are the ones who can sell the best amount of hope. Actually, they're merchants of hope. Actually, in many ways.
Yeah, so I think Sonia Gandhi got it wrong when she called Modi in 2014 a maut ka saudagar. In fact, like you're saying, he's an ummeed ka saudagar.
Exactly.
Right.
So, but the problem is that when it comes to delivery, they're not able to deliver. And there's something fundamentally wrong with the way our economies are structured, the way we are looking at it. Many people, many economists in India have written about this and have spoken about this. Everybody from Raghuram Rajan to Urjit Patel to various others, have looked at this problem. They have tried to find solutions for it. They have, and unfortunately, we have not been able to get our act together, and there are many reasons for it. I'll go deeper into what the deeper reasons are why we are not able to. So I think they're right to feel a bit hopeless, and they're looking for change, and anything could trigger that anger.
Just as a quick follow-up, right, now that you've sort of opened this sort of box of Gen Z and what the economic constraints that they face, I just wanted to understand, given the global aspirations and the delivery of largely what are called precarious gig jobs that are being offered, in this light, what does it say that Nepal's youth, the Gen Z, are railing openly against what they call Nepo Babies that we saw in the protests. Whereas in India, our youth are celebrating a very rich, extravagant wedding that Mr. Ambani had for his children, saying that it is his money, he's spending it, why should we be concerned about it?
You're absolutely right. In fact, it shocked me that when all those visuals were being shown of the Ambani wedding, people were enjoying it. Nobody was raising the question of how such inequality can exist in a country with such deep poverty, with a median income of no more than maybe $80 or $90 in India per month. People with 8,000 rupees or something in a monthly average median income are watching millions and sometimes tens of millions of dollars being spent on weddings. Nobody's questioning it. One can go into it in depth, but there are a range of reasons for it, of acceptance. It could be this controlled media that we have, mainstream media. It's also partly the religious nature of the population, where people accept it as our fate and push it to another life. It's also, to a large extent, the fact that this dream is being sold of capitalism, that you too can become rich. You too can one day, if you work hard enough, join this elite company.
A different version of the American dream.
A different version of the American dream. And also this assumption that these people are special people, that they are different from us. They are kind of demigods. We can watch them like we would watch, say, Zeus or Jupiter on his Olympic throne, while we have to lead our plebeian lives and maybe get some vicarious pleasure the way we are watching a Bollywood movie of some kind in the 1980s. We would enjoy watching some extravagance on the screen because that gives us an escape for a little while from our miserable existence.
It's very interesting because the one feature of the political economy that I've noticed over the last at least 2 decades is that failure is individualized. Earlier, when, let's say, people of my father's generation did not have a job, they could actually rail against what was called an unemployment problem. It was a structural issue. Therefore, they could ask the government about its economic policies, where they're investing, and so on. But now it seems like the mirror has been turned around, where if you don't have a job right now, you need to seriously go and upskill yourself. There are websites called Upgrade, where you, again, after getting a degree, you pay another 3 lakhs or 5 lakhs to upskill yourself. So essentially, and then of course this retinue of skill censuses that are being done, where essentially what they're trying to tell all these people is that if you don't have a job, it is because you're not good enough.
Exactly.
It is not because of some structural issue that of the economy as such,
exactly.
which was a case prior.
That's why the only booming sector, in one of the few booming sectors, is education.
So do you think
India.
this change also has a serious psychological impact that Elisha was talking about on Gen Z?
Absolutely. It also shows the vacuousness of our politics. None of the politicians, except for Rahul Gandhi, is even taking up the issue of inequality, is seriously addressing this issue of inequality. It seems like they are part of the comprador elite, that is the complicit with the ruling elite. That is, even though they represent maybe the lower classes, but they are kind of complicit with capital. And nobody is taking up this issue. I mean, this stark poverty, which would have energized any other previous generation of Indian politicians and Indian citizens, is not energizing them at all. So when the young are looking, they're not seeing any options also, in the apart from one or two in the political elite. And because the way the media is massaging it and packaging it and hiding it, you're not seeing any outrage. People are not getting outraged. You're absolutely right that as I said, the only booming sectors in the Indian economy are those where you are either skilling or education, because because again, they are sectors of hope. They're giving hope that you skill yourself, you educate yourself, you may get a good job. But in the end, people find that even after that, they're ending up joining a gig economy, or they're joining some violent Sena on the ground, or they exit the country. You see a lot of legal and illegal migration from the country, because and most of these are young people, because they feel that their opportunity lies abroad, similar to what was experienced in Nepal and other parts. And the question is, what happens if the outside people shut their doors? What if the West and others, which is happening, they're shutting their doors, their opportunities are not good there, what's going to happen? It's going to build up pressure here. You need to find some outlet for them, you need to find some gainful employment for them, or provide them with some minimum basic income. And there are many people who are talking about this in various ways. Some people are saying, look, let's turn autarkic. Some people are saying, no, we have to enter global value chains, etc. Even in that, we'll come to that, India's failure in terms of manufacturing, etc. We are like less than 1% of the global value chain on electronics. We're not able to enter that. We're not able to just generate that mass and employment, which East Asia and others were able to generate for their youth bulges.
Yeah, I mean, what you pointed out regarding poverty and inequality. Now, the classic liberal position is that inequality is framed as something which is naturally occurring. In fact, Manu Joseph, in his very recent book, Why the Poor Don't Kill the Rich, in his last chapter, he sort of declares it as a fact that inequality is natural. It cannot be done away with. But as Kaushik Basu today again tweeted the book that Joseph Stiglitz has written, The Price of Inequality, where he's arguing that inequality is not a natural condition, that the states especially have to make efforts to ensure that you don't just focus on poverty by just arbitrarily changing the line below poverty line and then claiming that so many people have been pulled out of poverty. Rather, the focus has to be on massive inequalities that are being generated. Right.
Absolutely. And these inequalities have been generated. Let me be clear about that. India spends about 1.2% of its GDP on health, which is far below even other developing countries. The governments in other developing countries spend 5% or 6% on health. In developed countries, they go even further up. And there are other countries which spend up to 10% on health, including some developing countries. Just look at what, for example, Brazil is spending on health.
So do you think this is the root of the failure? Because it seems like the protests are rooted in what you described as a lack of opportunities, especially. Now, if you compare this with what happened in East Asia, where a lot of manufacturing jobs have been generated, in South Asian region, this hasn't happened, right? So, including India, where there's been a massive failure in creating mass manufacturing jobs. And as some in India would argue that, deep inequality and a sort of misinvestment that you're talking about, right, in terms of not investing in health and education and focusing on prestigious, ideologically driven projects. You think that is the root of this failure?
Absolutely. So if you look at East Asia, the reason for East Asia's rise is very high human capital, and that human capital and skilling was possible because so much was spent on education, so much was spent on health. For example, on education also, they on average spent about 6.6%, government spent 6.6% of GDP on education. We never came even close to that number. So we have not spent on health, we have not spent on education, we have not created the skilled workforce, the productive workforce, which would lead us to a launch. We missed the boat in the 1950s and 60s when Japan and South Korea developed. We missed the boat later in the 70s when others like Taiwan, Singapore, and then in the 80s when China developed, and finally in the 2000s when Vietnam has developed. Because in each of these cases, they did massive land redistributions. They provided basic health, basic education. They first raised the human capital of their populations. That means they were ready to be productive in a factory. At least you should be able to read the factory work signs on the boards to be productive. At least you should have a certain kind of a rational process of thinking which is inculcated in schools. The whole process of modernization which happened in the West from the 17th, 18th centuries onwards, that we just skipped all of that because our money went either into defense or it went into large-scale industrialization projects. We never prioritized these. So obviously we were not ready for the takeoff. On top of that, we had these autarkic policies. In the end, we didn't even have an integrated neighborhood. That is, East Asia provides a ecosystem. It's not just, say, Japan or just Taiwan or just China which got developed. The whole region got developed. But you look at South Asia as a region, it is not integrated. The whole region is not developed. There's very little trade, South Asian trade. So we missed that boat. And unless we start investing, instead of spending billions of dollars like the $25 billion which was earmarked for the PLI scheme, the PLI scheme is the performance-linked, production-linked incentive scheme which the government came up to increase manufacturing, which has not been a success at all in terms of generating jobs. We have actually a smaller percentage of our employment in manufacturing than we had 10 years ago. We have a smaller percentage of GDP coming from manufacturing than we had 10 years ago. By some measures, we might have only 12% of the population engaged in manufacturing, which is really low for a developing country which has cheap labor available. We could have instead invested that money in education, in health, in skilling. We would have created a workforce which would be more productive, whether it went into services or whether it went into manufacturing. It need not have been only manufacturing alone. As Raghuram Rajan and others have pointed out, we can even do high-level services skills. Now, the problem is we are going to miss the boat on both because of automation and because of AI. And we are not generating enough jobs. This demographic dividend, which is from 2005 to 2055, already 40% of that is gone because we are now in 2025. The remaining also may go. We may grow old before we grow rich. We may completely waste our demographic dividend. The same demographic dividend which helped China develop, which helped Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, they all developed during that boom period when the youth population or the working age population between 15 and 64 or the youth population between 15 and 35 was more than the children dependent population, which is children plus old people. So we need to seriously look at this issue because it's reaching crisis proportions. Only the people are not aware of it, as we discussed, thanks to the media and thanks to the culture, prevalent culture, and thanks to the lack of political options. People are not aware of it, but the moment they realize what's happening, we have been drinking this Kool-Aid of hyper-nationalism and identitarian politics for the last years.
I wanted to get to that this is a good segue actually. So I wanted to understand, given that a lack of opportunities and massive unemployment and a general disaffection of the Gen Z because of accrued mismanagement of politics over decades is similar in almost all South Asian countries, if not just South Asian, but also we've seen this in Brazil and also historically in the Middle East as well. Do you think that all of this might happen, the sort of response that we saw in Nepal is possible in India, firstly, and what role does the Hindutva project and what you called the Kool-Aid of hyper-nationalism, what role in terms of suppressing or masking or diverting some of these anger issues and channeling them into this so-called hyper-nationalist Hindutva project, what role do you see that playing? Where exactly are all these people who are unemployed? Where are they going to go? Where are they going?
First of all, I want to correct you a little bit. Brazil is not doing as badly as us. Brazil's per capita income is 3 times India's. When I tell people that, they're surprised. Brazil is a much richer economy and per capita income much higher than us. It has inequality, but slightly less than us. Income inequality is slightly less. Only South Africa is more income inequality than us. The fake data that we saw last month was basically because that World Bank report was showing consumption data. On consumption data, anyway, inequality is less because even poor people consume as much as their incomes. They consume, the difference in consumption data is not that much between poor and rich people because they also have to consume something to stay alive. But on income data, there's massive difference in India. India is one of the most unequal countries in income data and in wealth data also. The top 1% has almost a quarter of our income, 23%, and the top 10% is massively more.
60
Yeah,
something,
it's
So Oxfam comes up with an inequality report almost every year.
yeah,
Every 2 years.
yeah. So on income it's about 40%. On wealth it's about 60%. Okay, so we are massively unequal. We are more unequal than even Brazil in terms of Gini coefficient. The only country beating us is South Africa, and that's for various historical reasons because of racism and apartheid and all of that. So we rank up there, and part of the reason we are in this position is because of caste, because of our historical legacy of caste, and it's similar with other South Asian countries to some extent, even with Pakistan, etc. And we can see the similar Kool-Aid of religion masking this inequality and the economic problems in Pakistan for the last 30, 40 years. When Pakistan's politics was more secular in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, relatively, there was more talk about inequality. That's when the PPP and Bhutto, etc., came up with the new program.
Islamic socialism, whatever.
Socialism, yeah.
Variant
So,
they call it.
so definitely it serves to mask this. It helps to keep the elite in power. Religion by itself is a conservative force. It says that, look, whatever is your fate is due to your kismat, due to your karma. You should be happy with your position. God has decided in this way. You will get justice either in the next world or in the next life. Don't worry. Don't upset the social order. Maintain the hierarchy. Keep supporting it. God will, and if you pray to God, God will fix this situation.
Do your duty. Don't ask too many questions,
Yeah.
or don't talk about
Or-
rights.
Yeah, don't ask for rights. And if at most just pray and God will deliver either in this world, in this life, or in the next life, wherever that may be. So religion by itself, whether it's in the West or in the Islamic world or in India or anywhere, it serves to mask this. And that similar stuff is happening here. But, despite all of that, people are getting educated. And incomes are education levels are rising. So awareness is rising, especially due to the media. So at some point they're going to ask these questions, and it'll be difficult to control them. In fact, I'll point out a study by Urdal. It's a classic study in political science about why violence happens, conflict happens. And among the causal factors, he points out, is the number of young people, the youth, also the youth bulge, that is, whether the country is facing a youth bulge, also how employed it is, that is, if you're unemployed young men, they lead to more violence. But among the factors which surprised me was the level of education. So conflict goes up with the level of education, and the hypothesis is the reason it goes up is because people become aware of structural inequalities. They become aware of why they are suffering. A similar role could be achieved by the media or social media. That is, people becoming aware and spreading into masses can make them more prone to asking and demanding and conflictual politics. So this could be one of the ways in which both Nepal saw increasing revolutionary activity, Bangladesh saw. It didn't see this at low per capita income levels. It didn't see this at low education levels. As their education level rose, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, they became more conflictual. They started demanding more, the suppressed population. And maybe we'll see something similar in India. In fact, if you remember, in the 70s, the JP's movement was a student movement. It was a Chhatra movement, right? Because students are more aware of what's happening. And they have also, of course, as we discussed earlier, that the younger people have a lower risk tolerance. They have a higher risk tolerance, so they take more risks. The theory is that younger, and especially younger men, that is, the higher the level of testosterone. I mean, Pinker says, and some others say, that 95% of the violence that takes place in any society is young men between the ages of, say, 16, 17 and about 38, 39. If you were to lock up them, you would get rid of 95% of the violence. So these people with higher testosterone, with unemployment, they become more explosive.
I wouldn't want to comment on the biological aspect of it, but clearly the sociological impact of that, for instance, if you take that in India, is this, because of this gendered nature, a very highly intense gendered nature of patriarchy in India. If you're a man and you don't have a job, you're half a man, right? If you don't bring in income, if you don't take care of the family like a man should do, then you're half a man. Aap mard nahi ho. So therefore, this entire psychological insecurity and the channeling of this insecurity towards reclaiming this sort of lost masculinity, mardangi, right? Anand Patwardhan's brilliant documentary is again about how men get into bodybuilding and sort of become hoodlums and gundas for politicians. all of this sort of becomes part of this Hindutva project of absorbing what, again, many scholars have called the foot soldiers of fascism, or the shadow army that Dhirendra Jha talks about. Now, do you think the Hindutva project in India is strong enough, given the state capacity that probably most other South Asian nations do not have? Because remember, the Indian state is a very strong state, relatively speaking, compared to others, where even if we don't have the Western idea of a rule of law, we have the colonial hangover, understanding of law and order, bamboo, right? So that is the first go-to for almost what the Indian state wants to do. So given this combination of state capacity and the strength of the Hindutva project over the last 10, 12 years, and also the Modi factor, you think it can successfully divert this economic anger of these unemployed youth and sort of channel that towards communal hatred, preventing any sort of unified class movement that we've seen in, let's say, Nepal?
See, historically, all the way back, even from Marx's time, we have seen that Marx talks about the opium of the masses, that is, religion serves to reduce their anxieties, it helps to placate them, it helps to keep them in their position in society, that is, accept their fate. Gramsci, etc. Many have spoken about it, and we can see that in the modern world as well. That is, whether it's religion, or it could also be the capitalist dream that you will become rich one day if you just work hard enough. The American dream, keeping people in their position. But apart from that, you see there are various other ways of satisfying people. That is, you can give them a sense of self-worth if they join some army or some what are called the senas on the ground.
Shock absorbers, or something that absorbs the shock.
Yeah, or you can go for a Kavadiya yatra. You can feel empowered for a brief period of time. You can become a vigilante. You can take violence into your own hands. The
Gaurakshaks.
You can, so some way of satisfying their because ultimately human beings are not just about money, they are also about social status, and that matters a lot, and that's why what matters really is relative inequality, not absolute poverty. And you have to satisfy them in various ways. So there are various ways of doing that. We have seen that historically, we have seen that in our neighborhood also. As I mentioned, in Pakistan we have seen that, and we are seeing that in India too. That is the state is the state is powerful. I mean, the state was powerful even in Pakistan. It was the army managed to suppress the protests, if you remember, which happened 2-3 years ago. It was able to beat them down. Even in the Arab world, the Arab Spring was there for a brief period, and then the various militaries in the various countries cracked down, and they brought them down. So yes, it's possible that they'll be able to suppress it, but thankfully in India we have democracy, we have a process of voting. And as long as that remains sacrosanct and that is not interfered with, people can express themselves. In fact, the opposition serves as a kind of vent in most countries which have democracies. That is, people are able to express their anger through voting for an opposition candidate if they are dissatisfied with the current arrangement. It has happened in various countries. To some extent, that is what we saw in Nepal also, and Bangladesh also. When people feel that there is some kind of collusion going on, that is, the opposition and the government are colluding, there are no options, viable options, the media is colluding also, then it can explode, And when it explodes, sometimes even the army can't help you, especially if the security forces are not politicized. That is, in Pakistan, the army is politicized, but in Bangladesh, it was not that politicized. Even though it has been in power many times, it did not want to again take power. And that's why the army stepped aside and told Sheikh Hasina to leave. Similarly, in Nepal also, the army does not have a history of takeover. So the army also told the politicians, it told Oli and others that, look, we are not going to interfere, we're not going to fire on these protesters. In Bangladesh, in fact, the security force, the police did fire for a while and they killed hundreds of people. But finally, after 1,400 people died, the army took over and said, no more, we can't kill anymore. So, if the army has a track record like Pakistan can take over. But in our country, we still have electoral system, we have functioning democracy. And so it's unlikely that things will get out of hand in that way. But an Andolan could be launched. Jayaprakash Narayan launched an Andolan, Some other Andolan can emerge, At one point, the Jan Morcha VP Singh had launched an Andolan after the Bofors thing, and similar Andolans can be launched. Sometimes these andolans can turn religious, like for example the Ram Mandir movement in the late 80s, early 90s became quite violent, and again the state had to separate. But the people you have to get the numbers on the streets, and if you can get the numbers on the streets, sometimes change can happen.
How do you think that is possible? Because let's talk about the role of media, because you've touched upon it. In India, it's popularly called Godi media, and in fact, this sort of shared reality of economic pain, for it to be sort of reaching the ordinary citizen, and the citizen becoming aware of herself and the situation that they are finding themselves in, will require a lot of communication. Right. Now, traditionally, the role has been of the media has been to sort of bring some of these aspects to light and educate the citizen as well regarding what is happening. But in India, we see it's very easy to blame foreign conspirators, right? You see mainstream media, the so-called Godi media, railing against opposition, railing against George Soros, and calling anything and everything a foreign conspiracy. Right. Now, how much does this control of narrative that the government has, also, of course, the political economy of media forces them to rely almost 80% of their income revenue comes from government ads, which means that, they are very, very dependent on government. And we know the penchant of the current ruling dispensation in giving out, propaganda, basically advertising. A lot of money is spent on it. Now, how much does this control of narrative prevent public anger from reaching a critical point in India?
Difficult to say. Sometimes it has reached a critical anger. For example, the farmer protests.
Right.
Okay. The CA-NRC protests. It depends on how badly you are affected. Even in the case of the Agniveer protests, it did reach some point. But unfortunately, it was suppressed by saying that if you are found protesting and your photograph is taken, you will not be allowed to sit in any competition again. But if an issue deeply affects people, we saw this in America. For example, the anti-Vietnam War protests. It really affected the young people personally, and they came out on the street. There was a youth bulge in America in those days. I said the boomers in the 1960s, and they forced the government to withdraw from the Vietnam War. Basically, America didn't lose in Vietnam necessarily militarily. It lost the domestic political battle to continue the war in Vietnam, and we have seen this again and again. When people come out on the street, if it affects them personally, it's very difficult to suppress them. Now the question is, in India this has happened 2-3 times, but we live in a segmented society which is segmented by ethnicity, by religion, by caste. So it's difficult for people to get together.
By algorithms also.
By algorithms. And apart from, and when you say opium of the masses, religion keeping people in the opium, another opium is social media. You keep staying on reels, you keep doing time pass.
It's an echo chamber also.
Okay, it's an echo chamber, it absorbs your time. So the frustration which an unemployed man would feel, say, or an unemployed woman would feel, is not filled because you're spending all your time on social media on this free internet data. So
it generates a confirmation bias also. You only believe what you want to believe because you are in that echo chamber.
But it can work the other way around also. As we saw in the case of Nepal, a lot of reels were being made about Nepo babies and the corrupt politicians, their children and their lifestyle, which fueled anger also. So it can work the other way around also. And we saw that in the Occupy Wall Street movement also in the US. So social media can be a double-edged sword. In fact, social media is more free even in India and in most countries than is the official media, the mainstream media.
In fact, after the 2024 election, one of the first tasks of the government was to bring in the broadcasters bill.
Exactly, and to reward the influencers with awards so as to keep them in line. So the problem is also a lot of the young generation is very compliant, that is, they're not contrarian like previous generations. Again, it's the fact there's something to do with political ideology, it's something to do with also the kind of societal values and religious values that are being inculcated. There's very little questioning. We have generally had, even in our schooling systems, a way of kind of rote learning and enforcement within the family as well of norms that which are traditional and conservative. That is, questioning is looked down upon. You would be surprised that students are shouted upon if they ask a question in class. Even when they're in college, they would rarely stand up and ask a question. They're afraid. And so you tend to imbibe the values, internalize, as Nietzsche says, you internalize the law.
All in the name of tradition, safeguarding tradition, mind you.
Safeguarding tradition could also be fear, because the state can be violent. So the repercussions can be quite extreme. So they internalize the law, they don't even challenge, and we end up doing some kind of self-censorship. That is what the state also wants. It wants you to censor yourself. That's the point of the oppression. It's not necessarily just to force you, but also you yourself policing yourself. You're doing a self-censorship. You're not even speaking out loud what you think. The kind of stuff that we saw in Eastern Europe and during communist times. A lot of research has shown that actually in Eastern Europe, most people were unhappy with the government, but they were not aware that the next person also was feeling likewise, because they were not speaking up. So they did not know that they had enough of a critical mass until some freedom was given due to perestroika and glasnost. And the moment that freedom was given, by 89, the whole edifice had collapsed, because the illusion that most people were compliant and were happy with communism collapsed. So the self-censorship can also be a way of keeping things in check.
Now, moving to the big question before we end this interview, is this possible in India?
What happened in Nepal?
Yes.
What happened in...
What's been happening in our neighborhood over the last decade? Is it going to happen in India? If at all, how is it going to happen?
See, in India, there is a way from time to time to express your anger through the ballot box, and hopefully people will continue doing that. Alternatives have to be thrown up, ideologies have to come up, which, and given the way human beings are, something comes up from time to time.
Just to intervene, now if one understands democracy as a set of processes, one of the biggest jamboree that we have every 5 years is general election, and like you rightly mentioned, it becomes one of those platforms where Indian elections are about not preferring a candidate, or asking somebody that we don't prefer instead of choosing a candidate, because you just need to get you don't need more than 50% of the vote to win the seat, number one. And number two, you just have to get more than this other person who's finishing second, right? Meaning most of the candidates who win, who are preferred, usually get somewhere around 35% on an average, which means that they are actually not choosing somebody, the most likely candidate, but they're saying these are the candidates we don't want. So it is a rejection also. Now, all of this is true in the Indian case when it comes to understanding democracy as a process, but even that is being questioned now. What with happening with the Election Commission of India and the slogan that has gone very popular in Bihar right now, which is called Vote Chori.
So, yeah, I mean, if that happens, then of course there will be problems. But as long as we can at least be sure of our electoral processes, we may end up at some point getting an option, as long as our social media is free and not controlled, of getting an option without so much violence. But should that be suppressed? Should social media be suppressed at some point? Or if people feel that election results have not been fair, then you may see a very different outcome. Because if people feel that they don't have any outlet, things can deteriorate very fast.
Let's open this phrase that you use, the people. Right now, this is a phrase that most autocrats across the world, most strongmen across the world have used. They obviously say that we represent the people. Now, nobody knows who these people are unless you define it. Now, in the case of India, who are these people? That is very important, because the state's response will also depend on exactly who these people are. I'll just give you two quick examples. One, you mentioned about the CAA NRC protests, right? Now, the response of the state when it came to these protests is markedly different from how the response of the state was when it came to the farmers.
That's true.
Secondly, if you go back in history a little bit, the protest against the Mandal Commission and some of the protesters, they're variously being described as basically the protesters going out and having a field day, like they're going on a picnic, holding placards and so on and so forth. And the state's response was very, very friendly. In fact, the state responded by saying that, yes, we understand you have certain rights and we will let you speak your mind, and we are not going to beat you up like we do other protesters. So clearly it seems that the state also has a particular way of responding to who the protester is rather than what the protest is about.
Absolutely right. And many people, including Thomas Blom Hansen, have spoken about this.
He talks about the distinction between the law of force and the force of law.
Exactly. So we saw that even in the CAA protests. People get surprised when I say dozens of protesters were shot down. We know that they were shot down because they were Muslims. In UP, for example, dozens of them were shot down. In other parts of India as well. So, absolutely right. If a Dalit or a Adivasi especially was to protest, the response would be very heavy from the state. But sometimes these things are not calculable. That is, sometimes the state is also not able to calculate the impact of its actions. And it might happen that that the process will flow smoothly and there will be elections and some alternatives will be thrown up if people feel the economic pain of the unemployment, etc. Or if they feel that there's some injustice being done and their voices are being suppressed, then you can never say, we saw that during the emergency as well. We saw it in various places. People can take risks, and we have a history in India. I'm quite hopeful of the Indian people. That is, when oppression came, for example, there was a Jatin Baga in Bengal. There was a young Periyar outside a temple in South India. There was Bhagat Singh. There was Saroha. There was Bakht Khan in the mutiny. There was a Badshah Khan. People rise up, when the situation comes. You can never predict and say that. I'm quite hopeful from the Indian youth. Let me put it this way. They won't take it lying down. But the question is that when will this come up? What will be the trigger? Now, one can't say. As you have seen in South Asia itself, the triggers have been different for the protests. So, what will be the trigger? What will cause it? But certainly, the unemployment situation is one which is not a happy one. We know that from the data. The question is, has the youth gone to sleep? Are they okay with this fate?
See, jobless growth has been a feature across the world. But what can India do to, let's say, prevent something of this sort to happen, prevent things getting out of hand?
We have to generate employment.
But where will the jobs come from? How?
Exactly. There are various options being given, everything from focusing on improving our skill levels, reskilling, moving more into services, especially in healthcare expenditure, increasing expenditure in healthcare, because there are good jobs there to be generated. Everything from, low-end manufacturing by making us a part of global value chains, and long-term solutions like spending more on education, etc., increasing the percentage. All kinds of solutions are being given, including, just massive Keynesian government expenditure on providing basics, like, for example, low-cost housing. Low-cost housing, if the government starts generating jobs in that, a lot of jobs can be generated by providing low-income housing. So there are various solutions which different economists have put forward. It's not a unsolvable problem. It's a difficult problem. Clearly a difficult problem because not many people have been able to solve it so far, but it's not an unsolvable problem, and we'll need to find some solutions for this, because as I see it, this is one of the main causes of anger today and hopelessness. So that can give rise to some very negative things. We have to find a solution there.
Hopefully. On that optimistic note, I'd like to thank Professor Mohsin for joining us on this special interview. And that's it for today. Hopefully, I get to see you next time. Until then, please take care.